My name is Rachel Morgan. I'm 36, I live in Boston, and if family stories like this one ever press on a bruise you still carry, I'd love for you to stay. Subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. Sometimes it helps to hear a voice that knows the road you've walked. This story is called, Dad Said I'd Never Make It, Now He Mops Floors in My Office. That night, our dining room felt like a courtroom. The roast chicken steamed in the center, potatoes nested in a white bowl, the good silverware catching light like small, patient witnesses. My father sat at the head of the table the way he always had, elbows firm on the oak, a king at a shrinking kingdom. My mother broke bread into careful halves, and my older brother, Daniel, scrolled his phone beneath the table edge, the glow turning his knuckles blue. I knew the signs. A silence that wasn't empty but crowded with what we would not say. There is a hush that comes to families right before something breaks, the way a lake stills before it gives way to ice. My father set his fork down, blade of it tapping porcelain. He looked at me as if I were a problem he'd been meaning to solve. "You'll never make it, Rachel," he said. No heat, just a verdict. "You don't have what it takes." He didn't raise his voice. That would have been kinder. Raised voices are human. They admit fear and confusion. His was cool, like the weather report. A certainty announced to the room. My mother took a drink of red wine and kept her eyes on the tablecloth. Daniel smirked the way boys do when they think they are on the winning team. There are sentences that don't end with periods. They end with doors. The first door slammed inside me, something small, a childhood door. I saw crayons on a kitchen floor, a crooked picture I'd held up once, my father murmuring, "Your brother could have done better." Another door shut. My sophomore dorm room, boxes half-packed, the text from him that day, "Told you so." Sometimes a life is just a hallway of doors closing until you learn to find a window. I tried to swallow, but the room was all throat. "Dad," I said, and the word felt unfamiliar in my mouth, like trying on a coat I'd outgrown. "Why would you say that?" "Because it's true," he said, and speared a potato. The strangest thing about cruelty is how ordinary the table looks while it happens. The steam of chicken, the shape of a napkin, the ticking kitchen clock that refuses to pause for heartbreak. When pain arrives in a hospital, there are monitors and white coats. When it arrives at home, it comes dressed as dinner. I thought of all the ways I could fight back, how I could stand and list the nights I stayed late at that diner to save money, the clients who'd found me because I refused to quit, the small victories I kept tucked like notes in my pocket. I wanted to hold up the proof the way kids hold up report cards, say see. But something in me understood. At last, that proof is useless to a person who has decided not to see you. So I did the bravest thing I knew. I took my napkin, folded it carefully, laid it beside my plate, and stood. My chair scraped the floor like a protest. My mother glanced up as if startled by a sudden wind. Daniel pretended not to look. My father lifted his chin, the king unmoved. "I'm going to be okay," I said. I wasn't sure if I was telling him or me. Outside, the early evening cold came up from the street and pressed its hand to my cheek. Boston in late fall smells like leaf mold and chimney smoke, tired and beloved. I walked without a coat, arms wrapped around myself, past the neighbors' lit windows where other families were passing salt and laughter. I let the city hold what my house could not. You learn certain truths as you walk. The first is that every family has a language. Ours was comparison. The second is that love without kindness isn't love. It's a ledger. The third is that the people who should have taught you who you are will sometimes teach you who you are not, and you will spend years unlearning their lesson. I didn't pack a bag that night. I didn't write a manifesto. I just put one foot in front of the other until the trembling in my hands quieted, until my breath loosened, until the word never, his word, stamped on my chest, began to fade like chalk in rain. At the corner, a bus hissed to a stop, doors folding open like a mouth about to tell the truth. I didn't get on. I watched a girl with a backpack climb the stairs, watched an old man steady himself with a pole, watched their faces become reflections and then disappear. I thought of the future as a bus I hadn't boarded yet. It would come again. I could wait for it. I could be ready. Behind me, our windows glowed like framed photographs. Inside, my father would finish his plate and call the meal a success. My mother would rinse wine glasses at the sink. Daniel would text a friend, "You won't believe this. People move on in the smallest ways after the biggest moments. Life always does this. It continues in a straight line while your heart takes the long way around." I turned my collar up and started home, not to surrender, but to gather what I'd need. The documents, the laptop, the courage that comes in handfuls, not floods. He had spoken his sentence, but he did not get to write my story. When I opened the front door, the conversation had already shifted. Whether tomorrow, a game on television, the ordinary knit back over the tier. My father looked at me as if I were late to my own life. I walked past him without a word, up the stairs that had raised me, into the room that still smelled faintly of teenage shampoo and hope. I took out a worn notebook from my desk drawer. On the first clean page, I wrote the simplest promise I could manage. I will not live smaller than my soul. Then I closed the book, because sometimes writing it is enough for one night. In the morning, I would begin again, quietly, stubbornly. But for now, I sat on the edge of my bed and listened to the house breathe, and I understood, in a way I never had, that the most dangerous thing a person can do is believe someone else's ending is their own. That was the night my life didn't change at all on the outside, and it was the night everything changed on the inside. I didn't sleep much after that night. Sleep requires safety, and safety requires a kind of faith I hadn't felt at that table in years. Instead, I lay awake and listened to the radiators tick, the old house doing its best impression of a heartbeat. In the gray hour before morning, memories came the way tides come, steadily, whether you invite them or not. I was 8 again, knees grass-stained, holding up a school art project, a lopsided lighthouse with a beam of yellow crayon cutting through a blue storm. "Look, Dad," I said, the words chirping out of me like a bird that didn't know about windows. He glanced, then called Daniel over and ruffled his hair. "Your brother's perspective is better," he said, pointing to a drawing Daniel had made weeks before. The comment wasn't cruel, just casual. That's the trouble with casual things. They slip into the bloodstream unnoticed. In our house, achievement had a sound. It sounded like applause in church basements when Daniel won the spelling bee, like camera shutters at science fairs, like the crisp slide of scholarship letters being opened. I learned early that love was loud when it belonged to him and quiet when it came near me. I don't mean my parents didn't care. I mean they kept their caring in a bank with strict withdrawal limits. My mother's gentleness came with conditions. My father's pride came with proof. By high school, I had mastered the choreography of being nearly enough. I studied late and learned to speak in classes where I wanted to vanish. I brought home grades that would have thrilled another family and watched my father's mouth flatten into that neutral line when he reached the B on the page. "You're smart," he'd say, as if announcing the weather again. "But you don't finish strong." He said it so often it became a family proverb. Daniel began to use it as a joke. "Finish strong, ratch," he'd tease when I set down a half-drunk glass of milk. When it was time for college, I went because it was the door everyone else was walking through. I carried boxes into a dorm that smelled of detergent and hope. The first months felt like being dropped into a conversation already in progress. Other people seemed to know the script. My brain learned the material, but something inside me lagged behind like a child trying to keep pace on an adult's sidewalk. I joined study groups and memorized frameworks, and watched my confidence dissolve in office hours under fluorescent lights. The day I withdrew was not dramatic. No slammed registrar windows or defiant speeches. I sat across from an academic advisor who had kind eyes and a clock behind her head. She asked if I wanted to take a leave, to consider counseling, to try again with fewer credits. I wanted to say yes to all of it, but the word that came out was no. When I wheeled my suitcase onto the curb, Boston felt colder than I remembered. I texted my father because that's what a daughter is supposed to do when she is lost. He replied with 2 words, "Told you." People think breaking happens like glass, one sharp instant and it's done. But for me, it was slower, like ice expanding in a crack. I took a job at a retail store that sold the kind of clothes you buy when you want to be a different person. I learned to fold denim into perfect stacks. I learned to say, "How can I help?" in a voice that didn't sound like mine. In the evenings, I took the bus home and counted my money twice, as if my hands might conjure more from the air if they believed hard enough. I dated once or twice. Nice men, ordinary men, men who would have made someone happy. I could not explain to them the strange math I was doing at all times, how every compliment had to be subtracted by an old criticism to arrive at a believable sum. I kept my life neat to avoid giving anyone a reason to say, "See, I knew you couldn't." It turns out neatness can be another form of fear. Sometimes, on Sundays, I would walk past our old church and sit on the back steps when no one was looking. The bricks were warm in summer, the stone unforgiving in November. I'd listen to the muffled hymns through the wall and think about all the stories I'd been told about purpose. The stories promised that if you listened closely enough, God would show you a plan printed clear as a map. I did listen. The only thing I could hear was my father's sentence echoing in the rafters of my skull. But the body has its own stubborn language. It will keep you moving even when your mind is certain you're stuck. I found little rituals to string across the blankness like lights. A notebook beside the bed where I wrote down one thing I managed each day, didn't cry at work, returned the customer's call, walked home even though it rained. Small as they were, they kept me tethered. One evening, after a long shift, I missed my bus and ducked into a diner to wait for the next. It was the kind of place that hasn't changed in 30 years. Checkerboard floor, cracked vinyl booths, pies under plastic domes. A waitress with silver hair and a name tag that said Marge poured me coffee she didn't charge me for. She looked at me the way women sometimes look at other women, as if some invisible thread told her what to ask and what to leave alone. "You working late," she said, and when I nodded, she added, "You'll be fine." It was not therapy. It was not a lecture or a life plan. It was a sentence handed over with a chipped mug, and somehow it reached a place my father's sentence could not. You'll be fine. Not exceptional, not chosen, not destined, fine. As in, you will continue. As in, you are not finished. On the walk home, I thought about all the ways we inherit our stories without noticing. My father had inherited his, too. A man who believed worth was a thing measured and meted out, not lived. That didn't excuse him. It simply made him smaller than the role he played in my head. Small enough, maybe, that I could begin to step around him. I didn't decide anything grand that night. I didn't enroll, proclaim, or reinvent. I went upstairs to my apartment, turned on the lamp with the crooked shade, and opened my notebook to a blank page. The pen hovered. What if I wrote, "I am not broken, only unfinished"? The line looked fragile sitting there alone. I closed the book and left it on the table like bread rising quietly under a towel. In the morning, I'd tie on my apron and catch my bus and say the same polite words I always said. But somewhere beneath the routine, something had shifted, barely but truly. If a life can break slowly, maybe it can mend that way too. In the days that followed the sentence I'd written, "What if I am not broken, only unfinished?" Began to work on me the way yeast works on dough you almost forgot you mixed. Nothing dramatic rose, just a slow, invisible lift. I started waking earlier. Not out of discipline at first, but because something in me was done with sleeping through my own life. I brewed coffee in the dim kitchen and wrote 3 lines before the sun admitted morning. The rules were simple. One thing I'd learned, one thing I'd done, one thing I'd try. Sometimes the lines were plain as grocery lists. Learned, buses run late when it rains. Done, called Mrs. Patel back. Try, ask for more hours. Sometimes they were braver. Learned, I am not obligated to be small. Done, applied. Try, say yes even if my hands shake. A small help wanted sign in a cafe window on Tremont Street caught my eye on a Wednesday. The paper curled at the edges like it had been waiting for me longer than it should. The manager interviewed me between the clatter of plates and the hiss of the espresso machine. "It's fast here," she said, glancing at the line. "You need to move and smile at the same time." I said I could do that. I wasn't sure if I could. She handed me a black apron and said, "Start tomorrow." The work was simple and relentless. Coffee doesn't weigh much until you carry it for hours. People don't ask for much until you owe 15 people a small thing at the same time. But there was a rhythm to it that felt honest. Fill the cup, wipe the counter, learn names and orders, watch the way a stranger's shoulders drop when you remember them. I started a little game to keep myself from drowning in the sameness. For each table, I'd try to do one thing that wasn't asked. A refill before the glance, a napkin placed beneath a sweating glass. How did the interview go? To a man who had mentioned it last week and probably believed no one was listening. In the margins of that work, another life began. After closing, I walked home with the smell of coffee stitched into my sleeves, opened my laptop on the wobbly table, and taught myself the kind of things other people had learned in rooms I never reached. I watched free tutorials made by generous strangers who spoke in clean steps and believed anyone could follow them. I paused and rewound and scribbled notes as if the act of writing could fasten the knowledge to me more firmly. Fonts and color theory, composition and brand voice, concepts that had once sounded like passwords to a party I wasn't invited to started to feel like tools I could hold. It wasn't easy to balance the two, the rushing cafe and the quiet screen. My eyes burned some nights. My palms ached from the work and my brain from the wanting. But repetition does something tender to fear. Each small success, a menu mock-up that finally looked like a menu, a flyer that no longer shouted but spoke, took the edge off the voice in my head that loved to say you can't. On my walks to work, I began to notice the city differently. Signs I had hurried past became small galleries. Some were ugly in ways you couldn't quite explain. Others made the street feel kinder for reasons you also couldn't fully name. I caught myself analyzing the curve of a letter on a bakery awning, the way a hardware store's window invited or repelled, the conversation between color and light on a rainy day. It felt like discovering a language I had always heard but never learned to speak. I kept Marge's sentence close, "You'll be fine," and tried to translate it into action. Fine didn't mean effortless. Fine meant continuing, so I continued. I took a free community class on small business basics at the library. I asked baristas whose posters I admired where they printed them. I bought a second-hand drawing tablet from a college kid who was leaving town and joked that he was upgrading to real life. He didn't know it, but he was handing me a bridge. One afternoon, between the morning rush and the lunchtime crowd, a woman came in wearing flour like snow. She ordered a cappuccino and leaned against the counter with the sigh of someone whose day had already outpaced her. The box she carried was stamped with the name of a bakery a few blocks down I'd passed 100 times. "New sign coming?" I asked, nodding at the box without thinking. God, I hope so, she said, laughing into her sleeve. The old one makes us look like we sell regrets. I smiled. I'm learning design, I told her, surprising myself with the present tense. If you ever want a second set of eyes, I'd be happy to look. She squinted at me, not unkindly. You do that. I'm trying to, I said. I could have listed my tutorials and my folders of drafts and the hours I'd spent on work no one would ever see. For once, I didn't feel like apologizing for where I was in the story. I wrote my email on the back of a receipt. She slipped it into her pocket with a nod that said maybe. I didn't go home that night expecting anything. Years of hearing not enough had taught me not to expect. But when her message arrived, a short, hopeful note with a few attached photos of a crooked window decal and a tired logo, it lit up the room. We can't pay much, she wrote, but we need help. Would you take a look? I stared at the screen longer than the situation required. Not because the job was big. It wasn't. Not because the money would change my life. It wouldn't. But because here was something I had quietly been building toward without allowing myself to name it. A request that required me to believe I had something to offer. I made tea, cleared a space on the table, and opened a blank canvas. The cursor blinked like a pulse. I began the way you begin anything worth doing, by paying attention. What did her shop smell like? What did the bread look like when it first came out of the oven? What did she want people to feel when they passed the window and decided to come in? I thought about the flower on her sleeves, the laugh she couldn't help, the way she said regrets with a baker's shrug. I tried to draw not just a logo, but a welcome. Hours later, when I sent the first draft, my hands shook a little over the keyboard. I closed the laptop without waiting for a reply. There is a particular vulnerability to offering your work to the world, even in small emails. It asks you to replace the old math, subtracting compliments by criticisms with a different equation. Effort plus honesty equals enough. Her answer came faster than I expected. This, she wrote, and nothing else at first. Then, this looks like us. I exhaled, in a way that felt like I hadn't since childhood. Not because a bakery had a new sign, but because for a moment I could see myself reflected back, not as the shadow in someone else's story, but as a person who could make a thing and make it well. I didn't tell my father. I didn't call my mother. The part of me that still lived at that table understood that some beginnings are too tender to bring home. Instead, I wrote my 3 lines before bed, the pen moving easier than it had in months. Learned. I can learn. Done, first draft sent. Try. Believe her when she says this looks like us. Outside, the city exhaled into night. Somewhere, dishes were being washed, homework was being argued over, a television laughed on without an audience. In my small apartment under the crooked lamp, I let the quiet collect. It did not feel empty anymore. It felt like a room where something had finally been invited to grow. The baker's reply stayed on my screen long after I'd read it. This looks like us. I don't think I'd ever been told that before. Not you're good or you're talented, but you saw me. It changed the way my hands moved over the keyboard. I adjusted the spacing, softened a corner, nudged the palette from a cheerless beige to the warm gold of bread just out of the oven. I sent a revised file with a few mock-ups on a front window and a box sticker, then rinsed my mug as if the ordinary act might keep the moment from floating away. 2 days later, she wrote again. Can you come by? I wrapped my apron after the morning rush and walked down Tremont, past Stoops and a row of small businesses that had started to feel like classmates in my new school. Her doorbell chimed the old-fashioned way. Inside, trays of morning buns shone like small suns. She wore the same flower I'd seen on her sleeve, the badge of a day that started before most alarms. She'd printed my design and taped it to the window with blue painter's tape. It was crooked and perfect in the way first steps are perfect. We stood there shoulder to shoulder, 2 women looking at a piece of paper and seeing a future. What do you think? She asked. I think it looks like you, I said, and felt that simple sentence settle into the room like a blessing. She smiled without apology. "We'll hire a guy to put up the real decal next week. Could you do a few menus too? Maybe some box labels?" She pulled a folded bill from the register and pressed it into my palm. It wasn't much. It was everything. Not because of the amount, but because it said, "Your work enters the world now, not just your notebook." Word did not spread like wildfire. Word spread like yeast. Quietly, then all at once in places you couldn't see. A florist 2 blocks over emailed because she liked the bakery's new window. A barber with a shop as narrow as a train car asked if I could make something that would look like steel, but feel like a handshake. I learned to ask questions I'd never been taught to ask. What do you want people to feel when they step in? Whose name do you hope they say when they leave? Some clients answered in paragraphs, others shrugged and said, "I don't know, just not cheesy." I learned to hear what lived underneath the words. I also learned the small humiliations people don't put in their becoming stories. The man who said my price was adorable and offered exposure like it was currency. The woman who loved every draft until the moment it asked her to decide. The email that never came back. I made mistakes I could feel in my teeth, typos that hid until the print run, a color that died under fluorescent lights. I absorbed them, wrote them down, and folded them into the rules I kept beside my desk. Proofread in the morning. Print tests under ugly light. Ask for a deposit, even when your voice trembles. At the cafe, I learned to live in 2 tempos. The rush taught me speed. The design taught me patience. Morning meant a line of cups and names that trained my brain to track details, to notice and remember. Night asked for the opposite, a stillness that let me hear what a curve of a letter is trying to say. On good days, the 2 lives braided together, my hands quick and my mind slow in all the right places. The first time I saw one of my pieces installed for real, I went alone. It was a Tuesday, clouds the color of dishwater. The decal clung to the bakery window, bright as if it had decided to hold its own sun. I walked past, then doubled back, pretending to check my phone the way people do when they hope no one sees them looking at themselves. My reflection hovered between the letters, ghost and author, and for a heartbeat I stood between who I had been told I was and the woman who was quietly making things. I didn't tell my father. Silence, I'd learned, can be a greenhouse when you use it right. The projects multiplied in small ways. I bartered a flyer for a mechanic who fixed my sputtering fan belt. I traded a menu redesign for a month of coffee I didn't need but liked holding. When someone at the cafe complimented a poster by the door, the manager tilted her head toward me. "She did that," she said, like the fact had just occurred to her. Pride arrived not as a trumpet, but as a tap on the shoulder. One evening, a customer stayed after closing to pick up 3 boxes of pastries for a school event. He wore the weary cheer of a public school teacher in April. He asked if our print shop was local. "It's me," I said, and he laughed in surprise, then turned serious in a way that made me feel older instantly. "I need a brochure for a fundraiser. We're trying to keep the music program from being cut." He showed me a trifold that had been photocopied to the point of despair. "Can you make this look like hope?" I took the paper home like a fragile thing. The brief was thin and noble. I stayed up late making something that sang without shouting, notes curling into margins, faces of kids not as decoration but as center. When he saw the draft, he put a hand over his mouth the way people do at weddings and funerals. "This might help," he said. It was the first time the work felt like an instrument and not just a product. There were setbacks, and they had ordinary names. Rent due. A laptop that froze before I saved. A rush job that ran past midnight and into a morning shift that did not care about my dreams. I cried once in the cafe's walk-in fridge, the only place where the world was cold enough to put out the small fire of panic. I wiped my face on a dish towel, counted backward from 10, the way I'd read in an article, and went back to the counter as if the chill had always belonged to my cheeks. The 3-line ritual kept me honest. Learned, ask for more details than feels polite. Done, said no to a client who wanted 10 logos for the price of one. Try, print a small run and take the loss if it teaches you something you won't forget. I began to understand that growth was not an escalator but a set of stairs in a building with bad lighting. You don't glide. You look for the next step with your foot and trust the stair will be there when your weight arrives. Months passed. The bakery's new sign gathered fingerprints from children pressing noses to glass. The school's fundraiser hit a number that made the principal cry on a Tuesday night in a fluorescent cafeteria. The florist sent me a photo of a couple under her awning, bouquet held like a secret. I kept each message in a folder labeled proof, not to wave at anyone, but to hand back to myself on the days the old sentence got loud. On a late afternoon, when the cafe's sunlight slanted into gold and the grinder finally fell quiet, a woman I hadn't noticed in line approached the counter without ordering. Mid-50s, eyes quick, posture like someone who taught for a living. "Rachel Morgan?" she asked, and when I nodded, she smiled the way you do when a name becomes a face at last. "You were in my sophomore English class," she said. "I'm Elaine Reynolds." Her name unlocked a row of lockers in my memory. She had been the first adult to circle one of my high school essays and write "There's a voice here." I'd carried that paper around for weeks like a talisman until life folded it into a box that moved with me too many times. "I've been seeing your work around the neighborhood," she said, glancing at the poster by the door. "It looks like you." The words landed with the same weight the bakers had, but deeper, like an echo finding its original note. We talked for 5 minutes that felt like more. She asked me what I wanted for the next year, and the question did not feel like a trap. For once, I said it out loud. "I want to make this official," I told her. "Not just projects, a business." She didn't flinch. "Then build it," she said, as if she were assigning a novel and a deadline. "And if you want a sounding board, come by my office hours." Writers and designers are cousins. We both try to put shape to what other people feel. When she left, the bell over the door sounded brighter. I wiped the counter in slow circles and imagined a name that would hold me like a promise. Something to steer by when the nights were long and the old words rose like weather. I didn't know it yet, but a North Star was already forming, first in my mouth as a thought, then under my pen as a plan, then, sooner than I believed, on the dotted line. I went home that night with MS Reynolds's words folded into my pocket like a hall pass, then build it. I sat at the kitchen table, cleared a constellation of coffee rings with the back of my hand, and opened a document I'd been too superstitious to name. The cursor blinked as if it had been waiting for me to stop pretending. I typed, "North Star Creative." Names matter. A name is a promise you make to yourself in public. I sketched the roughest of logos, nothing anyone else would keep, just a small, 5-pointed thing that didn't shout so much as point. I wrote down what I thought I could offer: brand identities for small businesses, menus and posters with a voice, websites that felt like a handshake instead of a pitch. Then I wrote the part I almost didn't: fair prices. Not cheap, not inflated. Fair. I could build from fair. Paperwork is the least romantic part of a dream, and it's the part that keeps the dream from blowing away. I stayed up reading how to file an LLC in Massachusetts, the difference between a business account and a shoebox, the quiet terror of taxes. In the morning, I printed forms at the library and signed my name more times than I had since middle school yearbooks. When the state confirmed what I'd created, it did so without fanfare, an email with a subject line that made me laugh for how ordinary it sounded. "Your registration is complete." Sometimes the universe grants you permission in a whisper. I told the cafe manager I needed fewer shifts and took the risk that the missing hours could be filled with paid work. I built a website by standing on the shoulders of a template and making it mine. I took photos of the bakery window at dawn, when there were no reflections to fuss with, and of the florist's awning when a couple kissed beneath it and didn't notice me. I wrote case studies in plain English. They wanted this, so we did that. Here is why it worked. I chose 3 fonts and swore loyalty to them until I deserved more. Clients came the way they always had, on foot, by introduction, inside sentences that began with "I heard you." Sometimes the ask was clear. Sometimes it was a sigh that needed translating. I learned to hold a discovery call like it was someone's story time. I asked what kept them up at night. I asked what they hoped someone would say after leaving their shop. I took notes that made my wrist ache and my heart widen. The first month as a real business nearly ate me. I said yes to everything because yes felt like oxygen and no felt like betrayal. A boutique wanted a rush job for a launch. I turned 3 drafts in 2 days and slept like a person who had outrun a storm. A nonprofit needed a rebrand by yesterday. I gave them a deadline that was human and wasn't sure if they'd choose me because of it. When they did, I learned the most important thing about the work. You are not designing for an award. You are designing for a room full of people who need a reason to care. I made mistakes and paid for them in small, necessary currencies. I underquoted because I underestimated the time life always takes. I overpromised because I forgot that printer jams count as time, too. I missed a family birthday and stood in a hallway listening to a voicemail from my mother saying she understood, the way people say we won't talk about this now. I wrote a new rule. Don't apologize for working. Do apologize when you vanish. Then I stopped vanishing. When the projects wouldn't fit on my wobbly table, I rented a desk in a co-working space that smelled like ambition and old coffee. There were other people like me there, building small ships with their names on the stern, photographers editing weddings at 2 a.m., a coder who could coax sense from chaos, a woman who made handmade soaps that sold out every weekend at the farmer's market. We traded favors and vendors, and the kind of pep talks that last just long enough to cross a thin bridge. It felt like a family made of friends, the way adulthood sometimes mercifully allows. One afternoon, a man in a suit too tight in the shoulders stopped at my table. "You the North Star one," he said, as if the name were a rumor. "I am," I said, trying to sound like I'd been that person for longer than a week. "I run the monthly street fair. We need a new look, banners, maps, social stuff. Something that makes people want to come even when it rains." He tapped the table twice with his knuckle, a habit of men who have more meetings than minutes. "You in?" I was. I built the campaign like a quilt, bright pieces stitched with care, a map that felt like an invitation instead of a lecture. On the day of the fair, I arrived early and watched vendors clip my signs to tents. Kids traced routes on the map with sticky fingers. A saxophonist played beneath a banner I had laid out at 1 a.m. And for the first time, I felt the scale of what design could be. Not just ink and pixels, but a reason for strangers to gather under one sky. When the checks came, they didn't look like triumph. They looked like envelopes. I opened them with the same steady gratitude I'd once opened tips, except now I put them in a real account and wrote the kind of memo lines that would make April kinder. I paid a photographer to shoot a small library of images I could use for the site. I bought a chair that didn't pinch my shoulder blades. My luxuries were ergonomic. The first time I hired someone, it was by the hour and it felt like a confession. Her name was Tasha, a design student who made colors do things I could only ask of them. I began by offloading the parts that ate time without feeding joy. She taught me keystrokes that saved minutes, hours, weekends. We shared a Dropbox folder and an unspoken agreement to be kind when notes were blunt. When I paid her, I stared at the number like it was a magic trick. I had turned my work into someone else's work, too, and we were both better for it. On a Tuesday night, Ms. Reynolds stopped by the co-working space with a box of donuts and a stack of used paperbacks for the common shelf. She sat on the edge of my desk, read a headline on a draft I'd been fussing with, and said, "You're burying your verb." She was right. She always had been. We argued fondly about adverbs like old friends who could afford to. "Have you told your family?" she asked, finally. "About all this?" I shook my head. "Not yet." She didn't press. "Sometimes you build the house before you invite anyone over," she said. "It's allowed." On the walk home, I detoured past the bakery. The window was a mirror at night, my logo bright, the loaves sleeping on racks like patient moons. I felt that strange ache again, not quite sadness, not quite joy. The ache of becoming, maybe. The ache of discovering that the person you are is sturdy enough to carry the person you were. The calls I dreaded from my father did not come because I hadn't made them. When I did see him, family commitments are their own gravity. The conversations were weather and errands and a silence that asked to be fed but wasn't. He asked what I was up to the way people ask a neighbor if they are still gardening. I told him I was busy. It was the truth, and it was not the story. I kept my head down and my heart open. Projects took me into corners of the city I had never had reason to enter. A boxing gym with walls the color of bruise and joy. A bookshop whose owner measured time in editions. A food truck that smelled like childhoods I hadn't had. I learned that running a business is half work and half listening for where the work is needed next. Sometimes it's a whisper behind you. Sometimes it's a knock at the exact door you haven't built yet. Late one evening, the co-working space emptied around me. I finalized a brand guide for a new client and exported files into neatly named folders. A kind of quiet came over the room. The good kind, not the kind that closes doors. I thought about the dinner table where this all started, about the sentence that had once felt like a map. It struck me then how small his words were compared to the size of a life lived anyway. I packed my bag, turned off my lamp, and glanced back at the table that had become a small country I could believe in. On the way out, I stopped at the bulletin board by the door and pinned a simple card I had finally allowed myself to print. North Star Creative, design that feels like you. A phone number, an email, a line that read by appointment only, not to make me sound important, but to remind me I could choose how to spend my days. Outside, the city breathed in neon and bus brakes and the soft shuffle of people going where they needed to go. I walked home carrying something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't triumph or proof. It was steadiness. The kind that makes room for whatever comes next. Good, hard, or both. I didn't know the shape of the next turn yet. I only knew I was ready to take it. The first real office came to me the way apartments do when you outgrow your lease. You don't wake up wanting more space. You trip over what you've made and realize the room is already too small. It started with a call from a community bank. A modest institution with tellers who knew their customers' dogs by name. They'd seen the street fair campaign and wanted to refresh a few branches without scaring anyone who'd kept their savings there since the 80s. "We don't want to look like the future," the VP said, half joking. "Just the present, but with better pens." It sounded exactly like the kind of careful work I'd learned to love. Designing not to impress a panel, but to make a grandmother feel comfortable signing her name. The scope meant meetings, and meetings meant a conference table that wasn't borrowed by the hour. I toured small offices the way people tour nurseries before a baby arrives. Hopeful, a little terrified, carrying a list of things I told myself I could live without. There was a space on the fourth floor of a brick building in the Leather District, windows that faced a fire escape and a slice of sky, paint the color of oatmeal. The landlord apologized for the scuffed baseboards. I ran my hand over them like they were proof of other people's beginnings. I signed a short lease and bought a rug that swallowed the echo. On the first morning, I brought in a plant I was not qualified to keep alive and a box of mugs that didn't match. Tasha taped a paper star above the door with our name in my quick handwriting. I kept waiting for an adult to walk in and ask where our parents were. No one did. Clients arrived, sat in chairs I'd gotten secondhand from a law firm that moved upstairs, and told us what they needed in accents shaped by neighborhoods I loved: Dorchester, Eastie, Hyde Park. We listened and made lists and timelines and asked for assets like detectives who had learned to say no, all of them. The work grew in layers. The bank became a rhythm, branch by branch, a palette that warmed what had gone gray with time, photos that looked like neighbors rather than stock people in generic smiles. The florist sent her sister, who ran a daycare that wanted less chaos in the brand than in the playroom. A small clinic came in with a waiting room brochure that made illness feel like paperwork. We made it kinder. The invoices went out and mostly came back. When they didn't, I learned the calm tone you use to ask for what you've earned without apologizing for needing it. I also learned the math no one posts about. The month a big check arrived a week too late, the way payroll is a promise you make with your whole body. I took a line of credit I didn't want because staring down a cash flow graph doesn't feed anyone. I said it out loud to myself when the pen hovered. This is a bridge, not a habit, and I crossed carefully. The building had a custodian named Lewis who worked nights. Sometimes I stayed late and heard the elevator doors sigh open, the roll of his bucket like a low tide. He'd wave, ask if I wanted the lights left on, tell me about his granddaughter's piano recital or the Sox game, whichever was better that week. The way he moved through the hall, steady, unbothered by other people's rush, calmed me in a way I didn't understand until much later. Work is work, his shuffle seemed to say. Dignity doesn't check job descriptions. We built systems because chaos is expensive. Monday morning stand-ups that lasted 15 minutes whether we wanted them to or not. A whiteboard with 3 columns, now, next, later. That kept our hopes from pretending to be emergencies. A template for proposals that stopped me from reinventing the wheel every time I was nervous. Tasha started gently scolding me when I opened Illustrator before answering email. Boundaries, she'd sing song, like it was a pop lyric. I made her take a long weekend after a sprint and covered the rest myself. The office looked empty without her music in the afternoons. When the bank's last branch went live, the VP shook my hand and said, "You made us look like ourselves." I said thank you, and then when he left, I sat at my desk and cried a little because the sentence had become a thread through everything we touched. Not clever. True. With the case study, a different kind of client appeared. A mid-sized property group that owned several commercial floors downtown. They wanted a rebrand that wouldn't make tenants feel like they'd been moved into a stranger's house. We met in a lobby that smelled faintly of lemon and new carpet, the kind of glass and steel geometry that had once made me feel like a visitor in my own city. The COO was brisk in a way I recognized from a lifetime of men used to hearing yes. He asked how big our team was. I told him the truth and didn't flinch. "We hire for taste and stamina," I said, "and when we need more hands, we bring in people we trust." He nodded, not quite impressed, but no longer skeptical. The project included wayfinding, signs that talk to people without making them feel talked down to. For weeks, I walked their buildings with a notebook and a cheap pedometer, counting steps between elevators and restrooms, noticing where people hesitated and turned in embarrassed circles. I sketched arrows that didn't shout and type that didn't scold. We tested in the wild. A delivery guy with a hand truck read one of our prototypes and found the service entrance on the first try. "Clean," he said, and I wrote it down as if he were an art director. During one of those site visits, late enough that the windows made black mirrors of the city, I heard the familiar squeak of a mop and the low scrape of a bucket somewhere down the corridor. The sound braided itself with memory in a way I couldn't place. I rounded a corner expecting to see Lewis and found another man, back turned, broad shoulders sloped with the kind of tired that comes from more than one kind of work. He hummed under his breath something that might have been a hymn. He didn't look up. I kept moving, feeling the odd prickle of recognition that wasn't recognition at all, just the way certain noises lay over childhood like tracing paper. The property group signed off on the first phase, then the second. We rented the office next door and knocked through a wall that had been pretending to be permanent. I bought a longer table and the kind of pencils that make you feel like a person who knows what she's doing. Tasha recommended a freelance copywriter named Jonah who could make a headline do 3 jobs and still sound like a person talking. On Fridays, we ate takeout around the table and argued kindly about whether green can be trustworthy. It can, but only some greens. MS. Reynolds came by with her red pen and a hug you have to earn. She stood in the doorway, took in the rug, the plant still hanging on, the taped paper star, and said, "Well, look at you." I told her about the wayfinding, how the man with the hand truck had given us the review of the year. "Real people are the only focus group that matters," she said, flipping through a brand book and pointing at a sentence I'd written that tried too hard. "This one, simpler." I crossed out 5 words and felt the entire paragraph sit up straighter. At home, the calls from my parents were a weather pattern I could predict. My mother with updates about cousins. My father with sports and small complaints about the price of things. He asked, now and then, if I was still doing that design stuff, as if it were a hobby that might politely bow out when real life entered the room. I said yes. He said, "Huh." That was the conversation. I felt nothing and then later felt everything in the long, private way that grown children do when the past leans on the present. The day the property group offered us a longer contract, the COO added, almost as an afterthought, "We've also got a floor becoming available in our Federal Street building. Smaller suite, good light, decent rate if you're quick. Might suit a firm like yours." He slid a folder across the table like it contained a test I hadn't studied for. I took it home and spread the photos on my kitchen table. Windows that faced the river's suggestion. A corridor with that sound, the bucket, the mop, the steady hush of a building being made ready for morning. I didn't sleep much, but it wasn't fear that kept me up. It was the shape of yes getting clearer. I could see Tasha at a desk by the window. I could see a wall where we'd pin drafts and let them breathe. I could see our name on a directory, not to brag, but so people wouldn't have to ask the security guard where to find us. I could see, for the first time, what it meant to build a place where other people could do their best work, too. In the morning, I called the COO with a voice I recognized. We took the suite. The lease slid under my pen, and I signed the syllables of my own name the way you sign for packages you know you ordered in a different season, and finally get to open. I texted MS. Reynolds a photo of the keys on my palm. She replied with a star emoji and the single word she'd started our friendship with years ago. Right. We moved in on a Saturday with borrowed dollies and the kind of laughter that comes from lifting together. The hallway smelled like lemon again. The bucket sang its small, steady song somewhere down the line. I paused, listening without knowing why. Then I put my shoulder under the other end of the table and carried it forward. We learned the new office by sound before anything else. The thrum of the elevator cables, the sigh of the HVAC finding its rhythm, the distant clatter of a cart hitting a door jamb on another floor. Light came in wider here, thin and honest, the kind that makes dust confess itself. Tasha claimed the desk by the window and immediately taped up a grid of color swatches that made the glass look like stained glass at certain hours. Jonah put 2 books on his corner, Strunk and White, and a dog-eared collection of headlines from old city papers, as if to say language should be lean and local. I brought in the old lamp with the crooked shade out of superstition. It didn't match anything, and that was the point. It was a witness, proof that the small table I used to work at had not been a phase, but a foundation. We pinned our first week's projects to a cork wall, a clinic that wanted to feel less clinical, a neighborhood theater that had a season of plays and no way to make them speak to one another, a coffee roaster who swore he could taste the difference between beans stored at 62 and 63 degrees. We wrote timelines in thick marker, and then, in thinner pen, wrote breathing room into the margins. Clients came with their particular messes and hopes. The theater had a director who wore scarves and said the word vision with his palms up. He wanted posters that could stand alone at bus stops, but also, when put side by side, became a larger image in the lobby. The coffee roaster wanted packaging that felt like a handshake you'd give a friend you actually liked. The clinic wanted, simply, to not make people feel worse. Each brief was a different way of asking the same thing. Help us look like who we already are on our best day. We structured our days into thirds, mornings for calls and the administrative ache of adulthood, afternoons for the slow work of making, evenings for proofing when the city's noise fell to a manageable hum. On Fridays, we shut laptops at 5 like a ceremony and walked to the corner bar where the bartender learned our names the way I learned fonts, by repetition and care. We toasted with seltzer more often than not. Building something, I'd learned, is a sober kind of joy. The building staff learned us, too. The security guard at the front desk, Marisol, with nail polish that changed with the weather, started waving us through with A morning stars. That never failed to recalibrate my mood. The daytime custodian had a radio on his cart, tuned low to a station that played Motown as if it were still the newest thing. At night, the sound changed. A slower rhythm, the wheels of a bucket rolling, the faint swish of a mop pulling yesterday off the floor. I thought of Louis in the other building and his granddaughter's recital. The memory made me kinder to the version of myself who had stayed late just to feel like the future could find me. One Tuesday, the theater's director brought the entire cast to review posters. They spilled into our space like a classroom returning from recess, voices high, bodies making claims on chairs and floor. We hung the drafts on the cork wall and asked them to stand 10 feet back. From that distance, the colors did their job. The actors' faces receded into the idea of a season. The titles spoke to each other without shouting. "It feels like us," the director said, and I watched the youngest actor exhale as if he'd been waiting to be included in an us for a very long time. There were less cinematic days. There was a 3-hour call about a shade of green that, in the client's lighting, turned into something the COO called hospital toothpaste. There was a printer who swore the files were fine and a stack of proof sheets that proved otherwise. There was payroll, heavier now, a promise that ticked in the back of my mind even as I was answering a question about kerning. I kept a spreadsheet with more tabs than pride, watched the line of credit dip and climb like a patient heart monitor, and reminded myself, bridge, not habit, when I wrote the monthly check. The first time we hosted a client presentation in the conference room we didn't technically have. We pushed 2 tables together and pretended the seam was a design choice. Jonah opened with a sentence so clean I could see the room lean toward it. Tasha walked through comps like a tour guide who loves the city she lives in, but refuses to condescend to tourists. I watched the client's eyes move from us to the wall and back again. When they nodded, it wasn't at the prettiness, it was at the rightness. A small click, a key finding the lock it had been cut for. In the evenings, when the building thinned to a skeleton of light, I sometimes took the long way to the elevator, past floors we didn't have reason to visit. The air changed by level. Lawyer floors smelled like dry paper and coffee gone cold, tech floors like new upholstery and a certain bright fatigue. On the maintenance level, the hall was unadorned and honest. Once, passing a supply closet propped open with a gray trash bin, I saw rows of bottled cleaner lined like soldiers and a pair of boots that had seen more winters than my business had invoices. A man's voice hummed somewhere down the corridor, a tune that tugged at a childhood I couldn't quite name. I paused, caught between curiosity and a respect I couldn't fake, then kept walking. Some songs ask to be found, some ask to be left to their work. At home, I stopped measuring my progress by what my father did or didn't say. It was a relief to let his silence be his, not a test I was failing. When we did speak, obligations are their own calendar. Our conversations were brief, like ships passing. He asked if I was keeping busy. I said I was. He said, "That's good," in a tone that could have belonged to anyone. After, I'd sit with the phone in my lap and feel the old ache nudge at the edges, then fade. Not everything needs to be healed to stop hurting every day. We hired a bookkeeper who treated receipts like plot points and closed months with a competence that made me want to apologize for every spreadsheet I'd abused. We brought in a photographer for a day to document work in the wild, signs where hands actually touched them, menus with coffee stains like proof of life, not flaws. I put the photos on our site with captions that spoke plain. A map a delivery guy can actually use. A logo that makes a kid press her face to the glass. In late autumn, the property group invited tenants to a small reception in the lobby. Cheese cut into polite squares, lemonade that tried to be punch. It was the kind of event where name tags earn their tape. I stood near the fern that wished it were a tree and listened, the way I always have, for how people described things when they forgot they were being overheard. "It's easier to find stuff now," a woman in a navy dress said, pointing vaguely at the ceiling as if the signs lived there. A man in work boots said, "They finally put the dock on the map," and I wanted to hug him for noticing devotion disguised as typography. As the crowd thinned, I stepped into the corridor to let the air settle. The building was in that in-between state, lights dimmed but not off, a hush that belonged to people who made morning possible. The squeak of a mop handle echoed, closer now, the bucket's wheels complaining about a bump in the threshold. A man's silhouette moved at the far end, broad and familiar only in the way men who have carried weight all their lives can look familiar in any city. He turned slightly, and for a heartbeat, my body did something my brain did not permit. It recognized where recognition had no business being. I told myself it was the setup of shoulders I'd known all my life, the economy of motion, the way a hand returns to a task it believes it's good at. I told myself a dozen reasonable things. The man bent, wrung out the mop with a practiced twist, and the bucket sang its steady note. He didn't look up. I let my breath out and felt foolish for having held it. Back upstairs, Tasha was pretending not to keep working. We packed up together, moved through the small lit circles of our office, turning off lamps like closing eyes. I locked the door and ran my thumb over the edge of the key, worn now in a way that felt like proof more than possession. We walked to the elevator and watched our reflections slide toward us as the doors opened. For a second, As the car descended, I saw our faces layered over a floor directory with our name printed in black. It looked ordinary. It looked like everything. On the street, night had settled into a kind of blue that forgives the day's mistakes. People hurried toward trains and dinners and places where their names meant something specific. I pulled my scarf tight and thought about the next morning's whiteboard, the now, the next, the later. I thought about the sound in the corridor that had reached back into a place I was sure I had outgrown. Then I thought about the work, the real, daily, human work, and the way it has a way of laying tracks under your feet if you just keep stepping. We turned the corner toward the T, and my phone buzzed with an email subject that made me stop on the sidewalk. New tenant orientation, Federal Street. The property group, efficient as ever, wanted us to attend a briefing next week for building services, deliveries, after-hours access. I smiled at the bureaucratic kindness of it. Someone had made a checklist so we could keep making our lists. Somewhere above us, a floor buffer word, smoothing the day's scuffs into something ready to be walked on again. The sound slid down the facade and into the night air like a reminder. Work goes on. People go on. And whether or not the past recognizes you, the future will ask what you're willing to carry forward. Orientation was held in a fluorescent room that tried its best to be friendly. A folding table with coffee that tasted like compromise, a plate of cookies that sweated under plastic wrap. The property group had thought of everything tenants forget, where the delivery dock lives, how to badge an after hours, who to call when the lights flicker, how not to set off the alarm just because you insisted on being the last one to leave. Marisol from our lobby wore a different badge here and looked taller without the desk. "Welcome to Federal Street," said a man with a clipboard whose suit fit like a uniform. "We'll keep this brief." He spoke in bullet points. Freight elevator scheduling, recycling rules, HVAC on weekends. A map of the building blossomed on the screen behind him, hallways like arteries, service corridors like capillaries. I took notes as if we were being quizzed. A woman from building services, Carla, hair pulled into a no-nonsense twist, took over for the part that actually mattered. "You'll meet our day crew in the halls," she said, "and you'll hear our night crew more than you'll see them." The room chuckled like she'd made a joke. She hadn't. "If you have special cleaning needs, leave a note on the inside of your door, not taped in the hallway. Fire code." She handed out a sheet with first names and shifts. I glanced down the list. Miguel, Ashad, Dev, Lewis. A last name leaped up like a fish breaking water. Morgan, Frank, Knights. I felt the ground tip just enough to make the coffee in my cup tremble. There are many Morgans in Boston, I told myself. Names are echoes. People repeat. I folded the sheet in half carefully, as if gentleness could make it untrue. Afterward, we walked the back corridors with Carla, the parts of a building that only people who keep a building alive get to know. The dock smelled exactly like every dock on Earth. Damp cardboard, diesel, a sweetness you couldn't place. A sign above the compactor read "No hands," as if that needed saying. Carla showed us the after-hours keypad, the way the alarm chirped before it scolded. "You'll hear this at night," she said, knocking her knuckles against a metal door that looked like it had already lived through 3 other jobs. Mechanical room, nothing to worry about. Back upstairs, the hallway logic made more sense now. The arrows we'd helped design pointed without shouting. A man with a toolbox greeted Carla by name, and she greeted him by the name of his dog. I thought about how much of a city runs on first names. Work absorbed us in the good way. The theater's bus ads went live, and strangers started sending us photos of them. Half proud, half teasing. "Saw your drama at the 39 stop." The clinic's new brochure landed in waiting rooms, and the director emailed late at night to say a patient had noticed the way the language didn't punish her for being sick. The coffee roaster bottled a cold brew in our label, and left us a crate we didn't need but drank anyway, like a celebration you could pour. The office settled into itself. Tasha adjusted the swatch grid for the winter light. Jonah taped a postcard of a Dorothea Lange photo above his corner to remind him that clarity is a kind of mercy. I brought in a second plant and immediately apologized to it for what we both knew was coming. We instituted a 3 o'clock stretch because our shoulders had begun to round like questions. At night, the building put on its other face. The ventilation lowered its voice. Emails slowed to a respectable trickle. Somewhere a vacuum sang its steady, unglamorous song. I stayed late more often than I meant to, not because I needed to prove anything, but because there is a kind of quiet that lets work become better than you are if you give it a few more inches. On one of those nights, the corridor outside our suite caught a draft, and the door snicked shut in a way that sounded like the end of a sentence. I stood, rolled my wrists, and walked out to the kitchenette for water. Down the hall, a figure moved in a pale circle of light, head bent, shoulders squared by habit. The bucket's wheels complained about the seam in the tile. He wrung the mop in a practiced twist, and the water answered in that low, hollow way I knew too well. I could have turned back. There was no reason to go forward. But my feet, traitors to my history, carried me a few steps farther, as if proximity could settle the question without asking it. The man straightened, wiped his hands on his pants, and turned to reach for the bottle of cleaner on the cart. Time didn't stop. It narrowed. My father at 60 looks like a man who once believed he'd never slow down and then did. The hair thinner, the jawline softened, the proud posture worn down by use. He has the shoulders of someone who learned to carry things without asking for help. He has my cheekbones and my grandfather's hands. He has a way of not noticing people when he doesn't expect them. He looked up. The recognition hit him in the eyes first, and then everywhere else at once. His mouth opened but didn't make a shape. He held the mop handle like a cane he hadn't needed a minute ago. We stood there in the indecent privacy of a public hallway. Two people who had rehearsed 1,000 conversations and were suddenly given none. Behind us, the building kept doing its job. The elevator dinged, a thermostat clicked, the city outside exhaled into the river. He cleared his throat, the same sound he made before Little League speeches and weather reports and verdicts. "Rachel," he said like a question, "there are many ways a life can deliver you to a moment." I had imagined this one with different props, papers shoved across a table, a voice lifted, a ledger balanced on a bright line of justice. Instead, there was a mop and a bucket and the smell of lemon standing in for mercy. A daughter who had learned to stand up straight, a father who had. We looked at each other and then at the floor between us because it was safer. I work nights here," he said finally, and the obviousness of it felt like a kindness. He glanced past me toward our door, our name in small black letters next to the suite number. "This your place?" "It is," I said. My voice surprised me by being gentle. "We moved in last month." He nodded once as if that explained something to someone who wasn't present. His eyes dropped to the floor and then rose again in emotion I recognized from childhood, searching for the version of me that would make this easier. I didn't offer her. I wasn't unkind. I simply stayed. "Good for you," he said, and for a second I saw the man from old photographs, young and sure, a hand on my shoulder like a promise. Then the years rolled back in. "It's honest work," he added, lifting the mop a few inches as if it needed defending. "It is," I said, and I meant it. I thought of Lewis, of the way dignity doesn't care what's printed on your badge. I thought of the way my own work had taught me not to measure worth by titles. Silence stretched, not hostile, just new. He looked at the cart, at his hands, at me again. The question that had lived in my chest since a dinner table long ago pressed forward, "Why did you say it?" And then stepped back like a guest who understands the timing of a toast. "Not now, not yet." He gestured clumsily toward the kitchenette. "You need me to, make sure." He let the sentence trail off where sentences go when people are trying not to say the wrong thing. "We're fine," I said. "Thank you." He nodded, grateful for a task not required. He set the mop back in the bucket and pushed the cart past me, careful not to brush my sleeve, as if physical contact might break whatever treaty the moment had declared. He moved with the same economical gait I'd watched all my childhood, the one that made our hallways seem shorter than they were. Back in the office, the air felt changed in the way rooms do after weather passes. Pressure dropped, something sharp scrubbed away. Tasha looked up from her screen, read my face in a blink, and didn't ask. She closed her laptop, bumped my shoulder with hers, and said, "Let's go home." On the train, the city's lights stitched themselves into a pattern I could almost read. I thought of the list I'd made for the morning, the now and next, and later waiting in their columns. I thought of the sheet from orientation folded in my drawer, a last name that matched mine. I thought of a Mops steady arc, how it is not a small thing to make a floor ready for another day of footsteps. At my stop, the air bit in that clean winter way that makes you feel less alone. I walked the 3 blocks to my building and climbed the stairs I could have taken blind. In my apartment, I turned on the lamp with the crooked shade and opened the notebook that had been keeping track of me. I didn't write a speech or a letter. I wrote 3 lines the way I always had. Learned, people are more complicated than the sentences we gave them. Done, stood where I thought I'd run. Try, carry dignity forward, no matter who forgot how to hand it to me. The heat clanked through the pipes like an old friend trying to remember a song. I closed the notebook and set it by the window, where the city made a small, moving constellation out of taillights and apartment lamps. Somewhere across town, a bucket's wheels rolled, and tomorrow's floors were becoming tomorrow. The morning after I saw him, I made coffee at home and didn't taste it. Habit carried me to the office. Unlock, lights, the soft thud of a bag on a chair. Tasha arrived with her headphones around her neck and a pastry she divided without comment, an offering to whatever weather had moved through me. We opened our laptops at the same moment, the way birds lift together without deciding to. Work, mercifully, is a kind of shelter. The theater needed final files to ship to the bus company. The clinic wanted a second run of brochures with a new phone line. Jonah slid me headlines for a property brochure, each one plain and sturdy as a good coat. I circled one that said exactly what it meant and nothing more. We built the day out of blocks and names and checkboxes you can hear click even when you don't. In the white space between tasks, my mind kept returning to the hallway. His hands, the mop, the way our names had suddenly meant more than sound. The temptation to narrate it, to assign moral and lesson, was strong. The truer thing was quieter. 2 people had met again under fluorescent lights. That was all and enough. At noon, MS Reynolds texted, "You free for 5?" I said yes. She appeared in our doorway like she always had, a small event, no ceremony. I told her as much as I could say without saying more than I knew. She listened until listening had done its work. "Do you want him to apologize?" she asked. "Yes," I said, and heard the child in me speaking. "But I don't think he knows how." "Then want it," she said, "and don't wait your life for it." She tapped the side of my notebook. "Keep writing your life anyway." That afternoon, a delivery guy rolled in a hand truck stacked with boxes of the theater's bus posters. He whistled at the top one the way men approve of a good catch. "Clean," he said. The word found the place inside me that had been unsteady and put its palm there. I cut the plastic, pulled one out, and leaned it on the table. We all stood, grinning like we had built an engine that finally turned over. Evening thinned the building to its bones. I stayed later than I meant to. Habit, yes, but also a small hope that repetition could turn shock into ordinary. At the kitchenette, I filled a paper cup and set another beside it. That was all, no note, no invitation, just the second cup. When I returned hours later, it was gone. Childish, maybe, but the small exchanges matter when the big ones won't move. For a handful of nights, we missed each other on purpose. I left earlier, he started later, or the opposite, or the same. The avoidance performed its own apology and then outlived its usefulness. On Thursday, I opened our door into his cart. The wheel bumped my shoe like a nudge. He stepped back. We both laughed, startled at the sound of it. "You're working late," he said, a sentence that belonged to fathers everywhere. "Deadlines," I answered, a sentence that belonged to daughters with keys. He rested his hand on the bucket's rim. "How's your mother?" he asked, and then flinched, realizing he'd reversed the roles. "She's fine," I said. I searched for the right size of word. "Constant." He nodded like a man who knows the weight of that. "She still keeps the good plates for no one," he said, and I smiled despite myself. It was an old joke, soft around the edges. Silence reached between us and for once didn't bruise. He cleared his throat. "I heard you've got your own outfit," he said, chin tipping toward the nameplate. "Looks real." "It is real," I said. I didn't add how long it took to believe that sentence myself. He gripped the mop handle and set it down again. "I was let go at the plant," he said, not looking at me, choosing the facts he could hold. "They outsourced the line. I did a little driving. A friend got me on nights here." He shrugged, and the shrug did what shrugs do, carry sorrow half the distance. "Honest work," he repeated, but this time it sounded less like defense and more like a prayer he'd been given and kept. I wanted to tell him I respected it, that he didn't have to excuse the motion of his hands. I wanted to tell him the day I'd cried on a walk-in fridge floor and gone back to pour coffee like it was liturgy. I didn't want to build a bridge out of words that couldn't bear us. So I said, "It is," and let the truth do its own walking. We stood there, father and daughter, with a floor between us made ready for strangers' footsteps. The question still pressed at my ribs, not a demand now, a simple human curiosity. Why those words? Why that night? I knew enough of grown men to know this wasn't the moment he would step back through decades and fetch an answer. He gestured toward our door. "You need me to skip in there?" he asked, defaulting to useful. "We're good," I said. "Thanks." I reached past him to toss my cup. "There's extra water in the fridge if you want it." It was nothing, it was something. Back at my desk, I wrote 3 lines under the day's work ticket. Learned, the truth can be small and still true. Done, met him without armor. Try, make room for the apology even if it never comes. I closed the file and felt my shoulders lower in a way that had nothing to do with posture. The next week brought a pitch I would have run from a year ago. A regional chain of clinics wanted a refresh across cities, not just one waiting room at a time. We put the deck together like a case we believed in. Not shiny models with no fingerprints. Photos of real hands holding real paper. Sentences a nurse would trust at 3 a.m. In the conference room, the executives spread across the table like chess pieces. One of them asked how large we were, voice freighted with the old test. I answered without apology. Small enough to know the names, big enough to scale the system. Jonah slid the next slide on the click and the room leaned in. We won it, not with the cheapest bid, with the right one. We took the elevator down with that floating feeling you get when you've told the truth and the world, for once, didn't make you pay for it. In the lobby, Marisol high-fived us over the desk, her nail polish the color of fresh limes. That night, as if the building were determined to keep teaching me, I found a scuff along our corridor, one sharp black arc where a dolly had cut its impatience into the paint. Reflex took over. I went back for a rag and the simple spray we kept under our sink. I knelt and rubbed until the mark softened, then surrendered. When I stood, my palms smelled like lemon, and I understood something uncomplicated. We all take turns making a place ready for morning. On a Friday, my mother called. We worked through the family list, birthdays, weather, a neighbor's fall, and the miracle of a quick recovery. At the end, her voice went light in the way it does when she's moving a heavy thing. "Your father says he ran into you," she said. "I suppose he did," I answered. "He said you looked well." She paused, then added, like a woman choosing a safe word, "He was proud of your office." In our language, that counted as thunder. After I hung up, I stared at the ceiling long enough to see shapes the plaster didn't intend. Pride is a strange currency. You can spend years fighting for it from the wrong bank. Then one day a small deposit arrives from a teller who never learned your name, and you decide you'll cash it and build something better with it than a ledger. The following Tuesday, I printed a schedule for the week and taped it by the door for our little team. Beneath it, on the corner of the whiteboard, I wrote a sentence that wasn't a goal exactly. It was a way to carry ourselves, do work that feels like people matter. Tasha underlined people. Jonah added a dot to the exclamation point I hadn't drawn. Later that evening, I heard the bucket before I saw it. My father appeared at the end of the hall, and this time recognition didn't knock me off my feet. He lifted 2 fingers in a peace sign without making it a joke. I opened our door wider, a gesture with no message beyond space. He passed, the lemon following like a quiet chorus. I went back inside and sat with the feeling that had taken the place of anger. Not forgiveness yet. Not a treaty signed with the grand pen. Something humbler, a clasp loosening. The room inhaled with me. The lamp with the crooked shade threw its faithful oval of light on the table. The plant, despite me, held on. I picked up my pen and began a list for tomorrow, forms for the clinic, notes for the theater's season announcement, a reminder to order printer ink and some fruit that wasn't on a muffin. At the bottom, without thinking too hard, I wrote in smaller letters, "Call him." Then I didn't. Not because I couldn't, but because sometimes the first step is letting the future sit on a line until it belongs in the now. Outside, a bus sighed to a stop. Somewhere, a door closed without slamming. The mop sang its steady arc in the hall, preparing the floor for other people's feet. I worked a while longer, the way you do when the day has given you more than you asked and less than you feared, and everything in you wants to answer by building something worth walking toward. Winter arrived the way Boston prefers, suddenly and with a memory. The river tightened into itself, and every doorway collected a small fan of salt. Our lobby grew a rack of umbrellas like a communal flower bed. Work didn't slow. The clinic rollout moved from comps to walls, and the theater's season announcement breathed its first in a lobby crowded with scarves and steam. We were busy in the honest way, not frantic, not idle, occupied by things that mattered enough to fuss over. On a Thursday, we presented the final wayfinding package to the property group. The coup, sleeves rolled, walked the corridors with us like a man reconsidering his own house. People found rooms without asking the desk. Deliveries arrived at docks that no longer felt like secrets. "No one will thank you for this," he said, and I smiled because I knew what he meant. Some victories are measured in what doesn't go wrong. Back upstairs, we ate takeout at the long table and edited a press release for the theater. Jonah cut 3 sentences that had been trying too hard and left one that sounded like a human invitation. Tasha showed me a refinement on the clinic's icon set, minute changes that made a soft difference. "It feels kinder," I said. She nodded, as if kind were a metric we could finally chart. In the late afternoon, the sky did that quick New England trick, light to dusk as if someone had flipped a switch. By 6, snow was falling hard, the kind that erases corners. Marisol poked her head into the elevator as we came down for a coffee run. "Storm warning just went up," she said. "They'll shut the garage early. If you're staying, plan on the tea." We stayed. Deadlines and weather have their own negotiations. Sometimes you pick the conversation you can win. By 9, the building had thinned to the faithful, a lawyer with shoulders up to his ears, a coder in a hoodie, a woman from HR whose heels clicked like a metronome. The heat shifted into that low-steam song old buildings know. The snow stacked itself against the glass. Around 10, the lights hiccuped. Once, twice, then steadied with less confidence than before. A minute later, the fire alarm gave one offended chirp and surrendered. The elevator took the hint and went on break. Somewhere, a generator coughed itself awake. Tasha looked at me over her monitor. "We're not getting stuck here, are we?" "Not if we move now," I said, grabbing my bag and the portable drive I'd learned to treat like oxygen. In the hallway, the emergency lights drew thin white rectangles on the carpet. We took the stairs with the small herd of people who had made the same calculation. On the landing between floors, a man with a maintenance badge propped the stairwell door with a rubber wedge and spoke into a walkie in a calm tone that made the rest of us borrow his calm. "Power cycles, stand by." We stood. On the next landing, I heard the bucket before I saw the man pushing it. In an outage, every ordinary sound gets promoted. The wheels announce themselves like a drum line. He was coming up, not down, because that is what you do when a building hiccups. You go toward the problem. When he saw us, he moved the cart aside to widen the passage. The emergency light made his edges sharper, the silver in his hair bright. "Stairs are clear to the lobby," he said to the group, not to me, and people thanked him the way they thank a person arranging a path rather than a fate. He didn't look surprised to see me. He looked like a man doing his job in a storm. I felt steadier for it. At the lobby, the glass doors wore snow like frosting. Marisol had her hair under a knit cap and her voice turned up to cut through the generator. "Tea is running on delays," she told anyone who asked. The property group had set out a tray of hot water and a jar of tea bags that made a decent attempt at hospitality. People took cups like communion and called their families. The storm blurred the city into a softer version of itself. For a moment, we were all the same kind of person, someone trying to get home. I checked the weather, did the math. The next train wasn't for 20 minutes, the one after that might not come at all. Tasha's line was worse. "Go," I told her. "If they cancel your train, text me and I'll find you a couch." She zipped her coat to her chin and hugged me the way people hug when they've lifted the same table enough times to skip the awkward part. He was near the back, talking with the day custodian, a woman I recognized by gait and radio. They consulted like medics. "You take that floor, I'll check this wing." When the day crew left to beat the weather, he stayed. Something about the way he angled himself into the work. No fuss, no pose, moved an old piece of furniture inside me. We are all eventually the shape of the tasks we repeat. We reached the subway platform with one of those small reliefs that feel larger than they should. Tasha's train came. Mine didn't. The announcer's voice did that apologetic monotone. A cluster of us waited 20 cold minutes for a bus that had the wrong route in its window and the right mercy in its driver. I watched the city pass in narrowed frames. The corner bar with a new chalkboard joke wearing a hat of snow, the florist's awning pulled in tight, the theater's poster glowing against a white night. A truck sprayed grit. People bent themselves into the wind and kept going. I recognized the posture. I slept like a person who'd kept moving in a storm. In the morning, the city woke up splotchily. We badged into a lobby that smelled like wet wool and lemon. The lights remembered how to behave. There were footprints on the tile. Our signs pointed at them like polite hosts. Marisol, hair back to its regular glory, gave me a look over her coffee that said, "You made it." I mimed a salute and meant it. We checked the suites for anything a generator could have chewed. One of the clinic's posters had peeled at a corner. I smoothed it down. A stack of the theater's brochures had slumped and recovered. Our office was as we'd left it, a few pens rolling into the same corner, the plant doing its best impression of resilient. On the whiteboard, under the weeks list, someone had drawn a small star that looked like a signature we hadn't decided to have. Around noon, I rode the elevator down for a sandwich and found him in the corridor, kneeling by a utility closet, tightening a valve with the kind of patience you only learn by outlasting stuck things. He glanced up, not surprise, recognition without flinch. "Crazy night," he said. "Boston doing Boston," I answered. He put his wrench down and stretched his hands the way men do when the day has asked them to hold one position too long. My impulse to narrate his life for him, why he was here, the sequence of events that had turned the father I knew into the man in front of me, had receded. What remained was a simpler questions. And now we were two people in a hallway on a Friday doing jobs. The past was not required to sign in. "Listen," he said, then let the word hover, cautious. He wiped his palms on a rag as if they needed to be clean for what came next. "About that night, the dinner." He kept his eyes on the valve as if apology were a creature you didn't want to scare. He stopped, started again with something truer. "I was wrong." The words didn't rush out. They arrived like boxes you don't want to drop. He kept going in short carries. "I thought I was telling you something that would make you tougher, or keep you from making mistakes I made." He laughed once without humor. "Turns out I was just mean, and proud, and wrong." I had rehearsed so many versions of this moment I didn't recognize the real one at first, the grand courtroom speech. The ledger balanced in bright ink, the silence broken like a spell. None of those were here, just the hallway, the snow melting on boots. The wrench, the rag, the small wooden ship of a man naming a storm he had started. "I'm sorry," he said, not the sorry of traffic or store aisles, the one you don't spend lightly. He looked up then, finally, to see where it landed. It landed, not like a trophy on a mantle, but like water in dry ground, quiet, absorbed, necessary. It didn't fix the years, nothing does. It made the next ones possible in a new way. "Thank you," I said. I meant all of it. Thank you for saying it, for not pretending, for not making me do the translation. My throat was thick in the ordinary way. I leaned on the doorframe because no one tells you apology has weight. We found a place just past the middle, what people who haven't done the work would call compromise, and people who have might call a boundary. I didn't promise to start over. He didn't ask me to forget. He told me he'd been let go twice in 2 years, that it had shocked his pride into a quieter creature, that he'd started walking early in the mornings because moving felt like proof he could still move, that he kept a notebook now, a little black thing he filled with lists to trick his days into coherence. I told him about the clinic's rollout and the theater's lobby, about the way a delivery guy's clean had become a North Star, about MS, Reynolds, and her habit of burying adverbs. He smiled at that. "She always liked you," he said, as if reporting from the front lines of my past. There was a moment where we might have tried to make it all ordinary too fast, ask about football, compare notes on shoveling. We didn't. We let the newness stand without draping it in small talk. He picked up the wrench. I adjusted the strap on my bag. We did our work. That afternoon, the clinic's COO sent a photo from a waiting room 2 towns over our sign against a freshly painted wall, a child leaning her head on her mother's shoulder beneath it. "Feels better already," he wrote. I forwarded it to the team. Tasha replied with a star emoji. Jonah wrote, "Right words, right place." I put my phone down and looked out at the sliver of river the office let us have. It carried chunks of ice, slow and stubborn and inevitable, making its way under bridges that had been there longer than anyone with an opinion. On my way out, I stopped at the supply closet where we keep the little things that keep a day going. Tape, markers, a roll of blue painter's tape that never runs out because it is apparently infinite. I took 2 cold bottles of water from our fridge and left one inside the closet on the shelf by the rags. No note, no ceremony, Just a practical kindness slid into the path of a man on his route. Outside, the city had already forgiven the storm. Plows had written their clean arithmetic on the streets. A dog leapt into a drift as if it had been training for this all year. I walked to the tee with the slow relief of someone who had been bracing for a blow and received a hand instead. At home, I opened the notebook that had been with me since the night a dinner table turned into a door. I wrote my 3 lines. Learned, apologies don't rewrite, they realign. Done, let the words land without making them carry more than they could. Try, invite him for coffee, not to fix, just to sit. I put down the pen and let the quiet do its job. The radiator ticked like a metronome someone had set to mend. The lamp threw its faithful oval, and in its light I could almost see the outline of the next day. Not a clear map. A good direction. Enough. The weeks that followed felt different, though nothing on the calendar said so. Work filled itself as it always had, clients with needs, deadlines that pressed, projects that carried our fingerprints out into the city. But there was less weight in my shoulders, as if an old backpack I'd forgotten I was wearing had finally been set down. I saw him sometimes in the hall. Not every night, not always long enough to talk, but enough to nod, enough to meet eyes without flinching. Once he lifted his hand in a half-wave. Once I left another bottle of water by the rags and found the empty in the trash the next morning. These were small exchanges, humble and quiet. Yet for me, they carried more meaning than the loudest arguments of the past. One evening, as I packed up my bag, I looked around our office. The long table scattered with drafts, Tasha's swatch grid-shifting colors in the winter light, Jonah's headlines taped to the cork wall, the plant still stubbornly green. The crooked lamp glowed the same oval it always had. I thought about the girl who once stood from a dinner table in tears, who carried those words like a curse. You'll never make it. She would not have believed this room existed, that her name could be on the door, that her work could carry kindness into the world, that her father's voice could change from judgment to apology. The truth is, we don't outrun our past, we learn how to walk beside it. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, it learns to soften its grip on us too. That night, before leaving, I wrote one last entry in the notebook that had followed me through every season. Learned, forgiveness doesn't erase, it frees. Done, carried my life forward on my own terms. Try, keep making space for love even in the unlikeliest places. I closed the cover, switched off the lights, and stepped into the hallway, ready for tomorrow's footsteps. To everyone who's listened to this story, thank you. Stories like these matter because they remind us that even from pain, something steady and beautiful can grow. I wish you health, and may your family bring you warmth, kindness, and the sort of love that makes tomorrow feel lighter than today. If this story touched you, I invite you to stay, to subscribe, so we can share more journeys together. Until next time, take care of yourselves and of each other.